The wind had teeth in the New Mexico territory, and in the dying days of 1886, it bit deep. It came off the high plains carrying nothing but grit and the smell of defeat. In the town of Copper Run, the wind was king. It screamed down the single-wide street, rattling the false fronts of the general store and the land office. It threw handfuls of red dust against the thick glass of the Buck Lantern Saloon, coating the windows in a film so fine it looked like dried blood. Inside the saloon, men drank with their hats on, their voices low. The talk was not of cattle prices or silver strikes. The talk was of ruin. The corn had withered black on the stalk in August. The creek, the Cedar Draw, had slowed to a brown trickle by September. Now, in late autumn, the ranchers' wells were tasting of mud. It was a dry plague, and a plague needed a cause. It needed a name. The name they found was Elowen Hart. She lived alone in the old line shack out towards Ash Mesa, in the shadow of the canyons. She was not a local. She had come up from the south 2 years prior, carrying nothing but a heavy wooden chest and a quiet that unnerved people. She kept to herself, walking the arroyos and hillsides, gathering roots and leaves. She made remedies, a poultice for a barbed wire cut, a bitter tea for a fever, a salve for a horse's cracked hoof. For a time, her work was welcome. She charged little, and her remedies often worked where the town doctor's whiskey-laced laudanum failed. But the line between healing and hexing is thin in a land worn down by fear. When the drought began, the whispers started. Ephraim Cutter, who ran the Copper Run Savings Bank and held the notes on half the valley, had been the first to say it aloud. He'd lost a calf, and he blamed her. Said she'd been seen walking his property line at dusk. Then, when the crops failed, the whispers found fertile ground. Reverend Silas Crowley, a man whose eyes burned with a fervor that saw sin in every shadow, took up the cause from his pulpit. He spoke of tares among the wheat, of strange women who turned from the light. The folk of Copper Run, decent people in decent times, were now thirsty, broke, and scared. They began to cross the street when they saw her. They nailed horseshoes over their doors, points up, to catch the bad luck she supposedly spread. They stopped calling her the healer. They started calling her the witch. The fire started near midnight. It began not as a roar, but as a flicker, a hungry orange light licking the dry timbers of the old barn at Ash Mesa Ranch. The ranch belonged to Rowan Pike, but the barn was rented to Elowen. It was where she kept her goats, her drying racks, and the heavy chest of herbs and seeds that was her livelihood. The wind found the flames instantly. The flicker became a torrent. Dry pine, cured by a decade of desert sun, exploded into a column of fire that punched a hole in the night. The sound was a living thing, a low, tearing growl that carried for miles. Rowan Pike was 2 miles away, in his own ranch house, checking the action on a Winchester. When the light painted his walls, he didn't pause, didn't stop to think. He grabbed the heavy wool-lined cloak from the peg by the door and was moving. He was on his horse, a big roan gelding, before the first frantic shouts from town reached him on the wind. He was a man carved from the high country granite, tall, solitary, and silent. He had come to Ash Mesa 3 years before, bought the failing ranch, and worked it alone. He spoke when he had to, mostly at the mercantile for flour and cartridges. The town found him as unsettling as they found Elowen, but for different reasons. Where she was seen as a dark, unknown quantity, Rowan was seen as a cold, known one. His eyes, the color of gunmetal, held a stillness that polite company could not breach. He was a man who had seen things and had been left wanting nothing to do with what he saw. He rode toward the fire, not with the frantic panic of a neighbor, but with the grim focus of a man heading into a fight he expected. He saw the glow become a volcano, shooting sparks that chased each other into the black sky. He heard the screaming. It was a sound he knew. It was not human. It was the sound of horses, a high-pitched, terrified shrieking that cut through the bass roar of the fire. Elowen's goats were in there, but his own spare horses were in the adjoining corral, and the wind was driving the fire right at them. When he crested the last rise, The scene was laid out below him like a page from Crowley's darkest sermons. The barn was a skeleton of fire. The corral fence was already catching, the horses inside rearing and smashing against the rails, their eyes white, and clustered near the ranch gate, lit by the terrible light, was the mob. There were maybe 30 of them, men from the saloon, ranchers from the dry valleys, even a few women clutching shawls at their throats. They were not fighting the fire, they were watching it. They held lanterns that looked pale against the inferno. Some held pitchforks, some held rifles. And in their midst stood Reverend Silas Crowley, his arms raised to the burning sky. "Behold the judgment," he bellowed, his voice cracking with righteous fury. "The tinder of sin is consumed, the hex is broken by the cleansing flame. Burn the witch," someone shouted from the back. "Burn the dark magic," another voice echoed. Rowan Pike rode his horse straight through the middle of them. He did not slow down. Men scattered, cursing as the roan pushed through. He ignored them, his eyes locked on the barn. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that seared his lungs and made the skin on his face tighten. He swung down from the saddle, grabbing his axe from its loop. "She's in there," a man yelled, pointing. "We seen her go enchanting. She was—" "The Lord provides the pyre," Crowley roared. Rowan paid them no mind. He ran to the corral first, the horses screaming at his approach. The gate latch was hot to the touch, but he forced it open, slapping the lead mare on the rump. "Get go!" The horses bolted, a wave of panicked flesh, and disappeared into the night. He turned to the barn. The main doors were barred from the outside. A heavy new forged iron hasp held them shut. Someone had locked her in. He saw Elowen then, a silhouette in the impossible brightness, her hands beating against the inside of the door. "Stand back!" Rowan yelled, though he knew she could not hear him. He lifted the axe. The heavy tool felt light in his hands. He brought it down not on the hasp, but on the thick wooden planks beside it. The first blow sent a shock up his arms. The second splintered the wood. The third broke it open. A wave of smoke, thick and black and smelling of burning pine and something else, something sharp and herbal, rolled out, pushing him back. He dropped the axe, wrapped his forearm in his cloak, and plunged inside. It was not a room, it was a throat. He could not breathe. He could not see. The roar was deafening. Embers rained down like angry stars. He stumbled over an overturned milking stool. "Elowen!" He heard a cry, a choked sob. To his left, he moved toward it, shielding his face. He found her on her knees, trying to open the door to a small pen. Inside, her small herd of goats was already down, lost to the smoke. "They're gone." Rowan's voice was a rasp. "We have to go, now." He grabbed her arm. She fought him, a wild, desperate strength in her small frame. "My chest! My herbs!" she screamed, her voice raw. "I have to. There is nothing," he yelled, pulling her hard. She was light, all bone and terror. He lifted her bodily from the ground, hooking an arm under her knees and clamping her against his chest. She shrieked, a sound of pure, primal loss, and beat against his shoulder. "No, my goats, my mother's seeds, please." Rowan turned and ran, his cloak held up to shield her head. He burst back out into the night, into the world of air and accusations. He was 10 feet from the doorway when the sound came, a deep, groaning crack of timber giving way. He didn't have time to run. He only had time to turn. The main roof beam, a foot-thick ponderosa pine log, gave way. The entire structure folded in on itself. A great gout of flame and embers shot upward, and then the roof collapsed, sending a shower of burning debris raining down where they stood. Rowan pivoted, putting his back to the blast. He hunched over Elowen, his heavy cloak taking the brunt of the assault. He felt the impacts, dozens of them, sharp and stinging, as burning shingles and fist-sized embers struck his shoulders and back. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, which was already full of gray ash. For a long second, the only sound was the whoosh of the collapse and the hiss of sparks dying on his cloak. The mob had gone silent, awestruck by the finality of the destruction. He stood up straight, shaking the embers from his shoulders. Elowen was coughing, a racking, painful sound. Her eyes were wide, staring at the flattened ruin of her life. "She cursed the draw," a voice said, clear and cold in the sudden quiet. Rowan turned. Ephraim Cutter stepped forward, his banker's suit immaculate even in the chaos. He pointed a clean finger at Elowen, who was still cradled in Rowan's arms. "That woman," Cutter announced, his voice carrying over the crackle of the flames. "She walked the cedar draw at the new moon. I saw her. She cast a hex on the water, and now our children go thirsty. She brought this on herself. She brought this fire." Rowan's voice was low, but it cut through the night like a blade. Crowley stepped up, his face slick with sweat and zeal. "It is the fire of righteousness. Pike, you are holding abomination in your arms. Step away and let the town see to its own." A murmur went through the crowd. Men shifted, gripping their rifles. They had been watching a fire. Now they were part of a reckoning. Rowan Pike looked at their faces. He saw the fear, the hate, the weakness. He saw men he knew, men he'd shared a drink with, now ready to kill a woman because their farms were dry. He looked down at Elowen. Her head had slumped against his chest, her fight gone, replaced by a shuddering that shook her whole body. He did not say another word. He did not look at Cutter or Crowley again. He turned his back on all of them, on the town, on the fire. He walked straight to his horse, which stood steady where he had left it, its eyes on him. With one powerful movement, he swung himself into the saddle, settling Elowen in front of him, her body draped across his lap. He pulled his cloak around her, covering her from the ash and the staring eyes. "Pike, stop," Crowley shouted. "You cannot harbor this. You will bring the curse on your own land." Rowan Pike gathered the reins. He spurred the roan, not into a gallop, but into a determined trot. He rode through the gate, past the burning ruin, and onto the dark road that led back to his ranch. No one raised a gun. No one moved to stop him. His departure was as absolute as the fire itself. He rode for an hour, the horse's hooves a steady rhythm in the cold, clear night. The glow of the fire faded behind them. The only light came from the stars, sharp and brilliant in the blackness. Elowen did not move. He thought she might be sleeping, but her breathing was too shallow, too ragged. He held her, his arm locked around her waist, her head resting on his chest. He could feel the faint, rapid beat of her heart against his ribs. As they reached the dark outline of his own ranch house, he slowed the horse to a walk. He looked down at her. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair matted with ash. She was unconscious. Her right hand was clenched into a fist, held tight against her stomach. He gently loosened her fingers, expecting to find nothing. Inside her palm was a small, scorched linen bag, the drawstring pulled tight. He could smell it, a faint, clean scent under the smoke. Time. It was a bag of seeds. It was the only thing she had saved. Elowen woke to the sound of a world trying to tear itself apart. The high, thin scream of the wind pressed against the log walls, a desperate animal clawing to get in. It was the only sound, a stark contrast to the roar of the fire that filled her memory. She was not on the ground. She was in a bed, under the heavy rasp of a wool blanket. Her body was a map of new pain. Her lungs felt scorched, her throat raw. Every breath tasted of ash and pine. She opened her eyes. The light was gray and weak, filtering through a single, clean window. The room was small, built of thick, dark logs. A cast-iron stove in the corner radiated a steady, dry heat. On a rough-hewn table, a coffee pot steamed next to a tin cup. She was in Rowan Pike's house. He was there, in a chair by the table, his back to her. He was not resting. He was cleaning a rifle, the parts laid out on an oiled cloth. The metallic slide and click of the lever action was precise, measured, and final. It was the only sound inside the cabin, a counter-rhythm to the wind's chaos. A memory flared, hot and sharp as the flames. Her mother's face, pale and slick with sweat, the sheets twisted in her fists. The fever had come up from the swamp, and the doctor's quinine did nothing. Elowen, just a girl of 12, had tried to spoon broth into her mouth, but it dribbled out. The smell of that room of sickness and vinegar and fear clogged her throat. Her mother had died at dawn, her hand so cold. Elowen had sworn then that she would never feel that helpless again. The memory dissolved. She was in a different place. Valle de l'Ombre, a village of adobe and dust south of the border. She was 16, a woman named Inez, with eyes as dark as unlit water and hands wrinkled as dried apples, was showing her how to crush datura seeds. Not too much. Nina, Inez had warned, her voice like rustling corn husks. The plant has a spirit. You do not command it. You ask. You listen. Everything the earth gives. It gives for a reason, even the pain. Elowen had spent 5 years there, learning the language of the roots and the secrets of the leaves. Inez had given her a new life, a purpose that was not rooted in fear, but in knowledge. Rowan stood, and she flinched, the blanket pulling tight to her chin. He did not turn. He walked to the stove, poured black coffee into the tin cup, and brought it over. He did not hand it to her. He placed it on the small crate beside the bed. He looked at her, his face lit by the gray morning. His eyes were as still as she remembered, the color of wet iron. He had looked at her just like that 4 months ago, when his best mare was dying. It was the summer sickness, a pox that blistered the skin and stole the breath. His foreman had wanted to shoot the horse. Rowan had stood with his rifle, his face a mask of loss, ready to do the hard thing. Elowen had walked onto his land, uninvited. "I can save her," she had said. He had stared at her, this strange woman the town was already beginning to whisper about. He looked at her hands, stained with herbs, and then back at her eyes. He had seen no fear in her, only focus. He had given a single nod. Try. For 3 days, she had worked in his stable, sleeping on the hay. She had bathed the mare in willow bark tea and forced a poultice of jewelweed and crushed plantain into the horse's mouth. Rowan had watched, often from the shadows of the stable door. He said nothing. He just watched her work, his presence a silent, assessing weight. On the 4th morning, the mare's fever broke. She was standing, drinking water. He had come in, run his hand down the horse's neck, and then turned to her. He'd pressed $2 silver into her palm. "You have steady hands," he'd said. It was the highest compliment she had ever received. A month later, in the mercantile, Ephraim Cutter had watched her buying sulfur and beeswax. "Strange, what some women buy." Cutter had said, loud enough for the whole store to hear, "Maybe if they prayed more and brewed less, the Lord would see fit to send us rain." Elowen had frozen, her hands tightening on her basket. She had felt the familiar cold prickle of shame, the urge to disappear, but a shadow fell over her. Rowan Pike had moved to stand beside her, his frame blocking Cutter from her view. He did not acknowledge the banker. He spoke to the shopkeep, his voice a low rumble. "Put her things on my account." Outside, in the dust, he had stopped her before she could flee. His gaze was not kind, but it was absolute. "They are small men, Miss Hart," he had said, looking at the mountains, not at her. "You are welcome to your barn at Ash Mesa. As long as you are on my land, no one will touch you." It had not been a promise of comfort. It had been a statement of borders. Now, in his cabin, the border had been breached, the fire had come. He had been true to his word, but the cost was ashes. "They'll come back," she whispered, her voice a dry crackle. The wind howled, and she mistook it for the mob. "Crowley, he won't stop." Rowan turned from the bed. He walked to the heavy plank door and picked up the double-barreled shotgun leaning against the wall. He broke it open, checked the shells, and snapped it shut with a heavy, definitive clack. He hung the gun on 2 wooden pegs beside the door frame, where it was in easy reach. Then he moved to the window. Checking the wooden shutter's latch, he tested the door's crossbar, sliding the thick beam of oak into its iron brackets. The sound was heavy, solid, final. He had built a fortress, and she was inside it. He went back to the table. On it, spread open, was a large paper, a map of the Cedar Draw watershed. It was marked with pencil lines, property borders, and notations. "They burned you out," Rowan said. His back to her again. He tapped the map. But they did it for this. Elowen pushed herself up, wincing. The wool blanket was rough against her skin, but the cold of the room was sharper. What is it? Water rights, my father's old survey. He pointed to a section upriver from his land, and hers. The cedar draw is fed by 3 springs. Up here, on the mesa, the flow is good. Or it was. He traced the line of the creek down through the valley, past his ranch, past Cutter's holdings, past the small farms. The drought is real, but it's not this real. The springs don't just die. He looked at her, and his eyes held a new light. Not just stillness, but a cold, calculating anger. Someone is stealing the water. Elowen, choking it off upstream, to make the drought worse. To what end? To buy the land for pennies when the ranchers go broke. To own the whole valley. Cutter's bank holds the note on every ranch that's failing. The curse that Ephraim Cutter had accused her of was a lie to cover a theft. They had needed a scapegoat, a distraction, and the strange woman who lived alone, the witch, was the perfect target. She swung her legs out of the bed. Her dress was singed and torn. Her feet were bare. The floorboards were cold and rough against her soles. I cannot stay here, she said, her voice shaking, but firm. I will not bring this to your door. Rowan, they will come for me, and they will bring fire for you, too. He turned fully then, and his sighs seemed to fill the small cabin. The fire is already here. It was here before you came. They just used you for kindling. He looked at the shotgun by the door. They won't find this house so easy to light. He spoke with a simplicity that left no room for argument. The trouble is with the one who struck the match, not with you. The finality in his voice broke something in her, the strength she had held on to in the barn, the fight that had kept her going for years. It all cracked. The images flooded her, the smell of her goats burning, the sound of the roof collapsing, the sight of her heavy wooden chest, her mother's chest slumping into the embers. It's all gone, she whispered, sinking onto the bench by the table. Everything. Rowan sat opposite her, the map between them. What was in the barn? My goats. The words felt like stones in her mouth. I know. What else? My drying racks, the winter supply, sage, yarrow, mullein. She ticked them off, her voice numb. My tools, the copper still Inez gave me, the mortars. What else? He pressed, his voice quiet, insistent. Seeds. From the old country, my grandmother's motherwort, rare strains of echinacea. They're gone. A tear tracked a clean line through the soot on her cheek. The book. It was my mother's. All her notes, all of Inez's teachings, everything I know. It was in that book. She bowed her head, her shoulders shaking. And a photograph, just one, of my parents. She had lost her past and her future in one night. She had nothing left but the small, scorched bag of thyme seeds still clutched in her hand. Rowan was silent for a long time. The wind moaned, and the stove ticked as the wood settled. He pushed the map aside. He reached for the coffee pot and the tin cup he had poured for her. The coffee had grown cool. He emptied it into a bucket on the floor and refilled it from the steaming pot. He slid the cup across the rough wood of the table until it touched her hands. It was hot, the metal almost too hot to hold, but the warmth was a shock, a sudden connection to the living world. Elowen looked up at him through her tears. His face was unreadable, his eyes fixed on her. He had saved her life, defended her name, and now he was sitting at her table while the world that wanted her dead howled outside his door. First, Rowan Pike said, his voice low and steady as the earth beneath them, you breathe. The next day, Rowan rode into Copper Run. He did not ride to the center of town. He kept to the back alleys, his roan's hooves muffled by the dust, and stopped at the sound of the hammer. Macklin Door's smithy was a cavern of soot and noise. The air was thick with coal smoke and the sharp tang of hot iron. Macklin, a man built like one of his own anvils, paused, his hammer hovering over a glowing horseshoe. He was sweating, and it was not just from the forge. seeing Rowan Pike in his doorway, the entire town on edge, was bad for business. "Pike," he grunted, not as a greeting, but as an acknowledgement of a problem. Rowan said nothing. He walked past the forge, his cloak still smelling faintly of smoke. From a leather satchel, he unwrapped a piece of cloth. Inside was the heavy, warped iron hasp from Elowen's barn door. He dropped it on the anvil. The sound was a dull, final thud. Macklin stared at the metal. He nudged it with his tongs, turning it over. "This is what barred her in." Rowan's voice was flat. "I see that," Macklin said, his eyes on the iron. "Not your work." It was not a question. Rowan had seen Macklin's hinges, his clasps. They were clean, balanced, functional. This was different. This was heavy, crude, and factory-made. The blacksmith shook his head, wiping his hands on a rag that was already black. "No, this ain't mine. This is heavy cast. St. Louis iron." He looked up, his eyes meeting Rowan's, and a flicker of fear passed through them. "We don't get this here. Too expensive to ship. I make my own." "Who imports St. Louis iron?" Macklin Dorr suddenly became very interested in the fire. He jabbed the forge with a poker, sending a shower of sparks up the flue. "That ain't my concern. Pike, you shot his horses last week, the black carriage team." Macklin froze. "Who?" "The man who imports this." Rowan tapped the hasp. The blacksmith let out a long breath, his shoulders slumping. He was a man caught. Only one man in Copper Run has that kind of credit. Only one man who thinks local iron ain't good enough for his gates. He spat into the slack tub. Ephraim Cutter. Rowan wrapped the hasp in the cloth and put it back in his satchel. He turned to leave. "Pike!" Macklin called out, his voice low. "I'm just a smith. I got a family. I didn't see you. You wasn't here." Rowan paused at the door, the bright rectangle of the alley framing him. "You're a good smith, Macklin. Don't let them make you a bad liar." He stepped out into the light, leaving the smith to his fire. The buck lantern was crowded for midday. Men who should have been mending fences or digging for new wells were here, nursing warm beers, their face drawn and worried. The air was blue with smoke. At a table in the corner, Reverend Silas Crowley was holding court. He was not preaching from a Bible. He was speaking as a general. The fire was a sign, Crowley declared, his voice carrying over the low murmur. "A divine cleansing, but the root of the evil remains. She is still here, sheltered by a man who would turn his back on his own community." A few men looked toward the door as Rowan entered. The saloon went quiet. Rowan ignored them. He walked to the bar, dropped a coin. "Bottle!" The barkeep slid him a full bottle of rye and a glass. Rowan took them to an empty table in the back, near a partition. He sat with his back to the wall. He poured a shot, but he did not drink. He slouched in his chair, letting his hat tip low over his eyes. He made himself look like just another rancher beaten down by the drought, seeking solace in the bottle. He listened. "We must protect ourselves," Crowley continued, his voice rising in fervor. "If the sheriff will not act, then the good men of this town must. I'm organizing a night watch, a patrol, to guard our water, our homes, our very souls, from the blight that walks among us." "What about Pike?" a man asked. "He's harboring her." "Pike has made his choice," Crowley said, his voice dropping, becoming intimate and venomous. "He has chosen the witch over his neighbors. He has chosen the sickness over the cure. The patrol will keep watch on Ash Mesa. We will see what evil seeks its own." Rowan let his head loll slightly, as if the whiskey was already taking hold. He closed his eyes, filtering the noise. He heard the clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair, and then, from the table just behind the partition, he caught the words he was waiting for. Two ranchers, their voices kept low. Crowley spooked 'em good. The first one said, "He's a fool, but he's a useful fool." The second replied, "Keeps 'em all looking at the witch. Nobody's looking up the draw. You think it's true what Tully said?" "I know it's true. Cutter showed me. It ain't much, just a small dam. He called it a temporary measure to hold back a reserve for the town. That's what he said. A reserve he controls. And meantime, my creek's bone dry. Hush. He said he'd open it soon as the rains come. It's for the good of the community. Funny how the good of the community always lines Cutter's pockets. The partition scraped as a chair pushed back. Rowan opened his eyes. He had what he came for. While Rowan sat in the smoke of the saloon, a different kind of meeting was happening at the ranch. Elowen was outside, by the well, cleaning the last of the soot from her hands with harsh lye soap. She was wearing a pair of Rowan's old denim trousers, cinched tight with a bit of rope, and a flannel shirt. They were clean, but they swam on her. She heard the wagon first, the rattle of it coming fast, and stopping short of the main house. She tensed, her eyes flying to the shotgun Rowan had left by the door. But it was not the mob. It was a single woman, clutching a bundle. Mary, the carpenter's wife. She looked terrified, not of Elowen, but of being seen. "Miss Hart," the woman whispered, rushing forward. "Please, they said awful things, but my boy." She opened the bundle. A small child, no more than 2, was flushed with fever, his breathing shallow, his stomach hard and distended. "Colic?" Elowen asked, her voice still raw from the smoke. "And a fever," Mary wept. "He ain't kept nothing down in a day. The doctor gave him whiskey and sugar, and it just made it worse. Please." Elowen looked at the woman's desperate face. This was the same town that had watched her barn burn. But this was not the town. This was a mother. This was a child. "Bring him inside," Elowen said. "For an hour." She worked. She had none of her tools, none of her carefully dried herbs, but the earth around Rowan's cabin still provided. She had gathered what she could. She steeped a tea from the wild mint growing by the water trough, a gentle thing to soothe the stomach. She crushed a bit of fennel seed she'd found in Rowan's pantry, boiling it with the mint. She cooled the liquid and patiently spooned it into the child's mouth, a few drops at a time, rubbing his tight belly with her thumb. She was no longer the victim from the fire. She was the healer. Her hands were steady. Her voice was low and calm. After a time, the child's rigid body softened. His breathing deepened, and he let out a long, weary sigh. He was asleep. Mary, the carpenter's wife, was crying again, but this time from relief. How can I?" "Keep him warm. Just this tea. No milk for a few hours. He'll be fine," Elowen said, handing her the rest of the tea in a jar. The woman clutched Elowen's hand. "They're wrong about you. I knew it. They're just scared." She looked over her shoulder, toward the road. "My husband. He's a good man, but he's afraid of Cutter. He heard things. At the bank." "What things?" Elowen asked. Mary pulled a folded piece of paper from her apron. "He told me to give this to Mr. Pike, but I'm giving it to you. You saved my boy." She pressed the note into Elowen's hand. "Be careful, miss. The town's full of whispers." She hurried away, her wagon rattling back toward Copper Run. Elowen unfolded the paper. It was a crude drawing, a map, and a sentence scrawled in pencil. "Someone guards the dam at moonrise." Rowan left the saloon. He walked his horse down the main street, making no secret of his departure. He needed them to know he was leaving. He was halfway to the edge of town when a man stepped out from the alley between the bank and the land office. Jax Tully. He was a man hired for his size, not his sense, and he wore his gun low, tied down like a man who practiced. He was Cutter's shadow. "Pike," Tully smiled, a greasy, confident expression. Leaving so soon, the Reverend was just getting to the good part. Rowan stopped his horse, his hands resting on the pommel of his saddle. "I'm not in your way. Tully, don't be in mine." "Oh, but you are," Tully said, stepping closer, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "You're in the bank's way, Mr. Cutter. He's a generous man. He's worried about you. Heard you had a guest. Heard you had some trouble. Fire's a terrible thing. Get to the point. The point is, Mr. Cutter is authorized to make you a final offer for Ash Mesa. A fair price, considering the drought and all." Tully's smile widened. He knows you're low on water, and a man with no water, well, he's got no ranch. Be ashamed to lose it all for nothing. Ash Mesa isn't for sale. You best reconsider." Tully's voice lost its friendly tone. "Water has a funny way of changing its mind. That Cedar Draw. It might just decide to dry up for good. Find a new course." He tapped his gun belt. "Sell to the bank, or the water will by itself change its course. Permanently." Rowan looked down at him. He did not look at the gun. He looked at Tully's eyes. "You tell Cutter. If you or any of his men step foot on my land again, I won't wait for the fire department." He nudged the roan, and the horse walked forward, forcing Tully to step back or be run down. Tully scrambled out of the way, his face dark with anger, his hand on his gun, but he did not draw. Rowan Pike did not look back. He rode hard, the anger a cold, clean fuel. When he got back to the ranch, the sun was low, painting the rocks a deep, bruised red. He found Elowen in the small lean-to behind the cabin. She had found a bundle of wild sage and was tying it with string, hanging it from the rafters to dry. The scent hit him before he even saw her, that dry, sharp, medicinal smell. It stopped him cold. The memory was instant, visceral. A small, dark room in a sod house in Kansas. He was 15. His younger sister, Sarah, was dying. It was the pox, and the fever wouldn't break. His mother had hung bundles of sage from the ceiling, burning it in a bowl, trying to cleanse the air, trying to fight the sickness with the only magic she knew. The room had smelled exactly like this. Sage and desperation. Sage and failure. Sarah had died on the 3rd day. He had been helpless, able to do nothing but watch. He had never smelled sage since without tasting that same ash in his throat. Elowen turned, her face smudged, her hands green from the stems. "Mary, the carpenter's wife, was here. Her son was sick." Rowan looked at the sage, then at her. The connection was absolute. He had failed to save his sister. He would not fail to save this woman. He took a slow breath, forcing the memory down. "I'm riding out tomorrow, before dawn, up the draw, to the high springs." He walked past her into the cabin, pulling his rifle from its scabbard. "You stay here, bar the door. Keep the shotgun loaded. If anyone but me comes to that door, you use it." Elowen followed him, holding out the folded piece of paper. "I'm going with you." "No." He laid his rifle on the table. "They're guarding it." She pushed the note onto the map. "At moonrise, the carpenter's wife gave it to me." Rowan read the note. His jaw tightened. A guard meant they were serious. It meant Tully's threat was real. "All the more reason for you to stay. This isn't a walk. It's trouble." "You're a rancher, Rowan," she said, her voice finding a strength he hadn't heard before. "You know cattle and horses. I know water. I know plants." She tapped the map, her finger tracing the line of the creek. "Inez taught me how to listen. I can hear water when it's wrong, when it's strangled." She called it, "I can smell a dam built of fresh-cut pine and damp earth. I can find it faster than you. You'll need me." He looked at her. She was not the terrified girl he had pulled from the fire. She was not the grieving woman who had collapsed at his table. This was Elowen Hart, the healer. She was right. He gave a single, sharp nod. The mood in the cabin changed. The time for talk was over. It became a silent, focused preparation. Rowan checked his rifle again, chambering around. He pulled a coil of heavy rope from a chest and slung it over his shoulder. He took a storm lantern from the shelf, filled it with oil. Elowen moved to the kitchen. She gathered what was left of the mint and fennel, and found a small tin of pine tar salve Rowan kept for his horses. She added it to a canvas satchel. She looked at the heavy shotgun by the door. It was too long for her, too cumbersome. Rowan saw her looking. He went to a wooden trunk at the foot of his bed, unlocked it, and took out a heavy, oilskin-wrapped bundle. Inside was a small, nickel-plated revolver, a Smith Wesson, .32 caliber. He walked over and offered it to her. "But first, do you know how to use this?" Elowen looked at the gun, It was cold and heavy in her hand. She hated the feel of it, but she hated the memory of the hasp on the door more. "Inez taught me," she said, her voice quiet. She checked the cylinder. The action familiar, practiced. She said some sickness requires lead. Rowan nodded. "We leave in 1 hour, before the moon gets high." The night was absolute. The moon, though rising, was still trapped behind the high canyon walls of the mesa, leaving the valley floor in a darkness that felt as thick as ink. They left the horses tied in a box canyon 2 miles from the cabin, the risk of a hoof striking rock too great. Now, they moved on foot, following the ghost of the cedar draw. The creek bed was not dry. It was a ribbon of damp, sucking mud that held the cold. The only sound was their own breathing and the distant, lonely cry of a coyote pack, their voices echoing off the unseen cliffs, a high, thin song of hunger. Rowan led, his long strides measured, his eyes seeming to pierce the blackness. He carried the rifle in one hand, the coil of rope slung over his shoulder. Elowen followed close behind, the small revolver heavy in her coat pocket, the canvas satchel bumping against her hip. The air was cold and sharp, stinging her raw lungs. But it was clean. It smelled of stone and the bitter, medicinal scent of the creosote bushes that dotted the landscape. They walked for what felt like an hour, climbing steadily as the canyon narrowed. The banks grew steeper, the boulders larger. Rowan paused, holding up a hand. He listened, tilting his head. "I don't hear anything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Exactly," Elowen whispered. She moved past him, to the edge of the shallow, muddy depression. "We should hear it, even a trickle. Water moving over rocks has a voice." She knelt, placing her hands on the damp earth. Then, she did something Rowan had never seen. She lay flat on her stomach and pressed her ear against the mud, her eyes closing. She was perfectly still, a shadow against the lesser shadows. The wind had died, and the silence was profound. She remained that way for a full minute, just listening to the earth. Rowan stood over her, his rifle ready, scanning the darkness. "What is it?" he finally asked. She pushed herself up, her face streaked with mud. "It's not stone," she said, her voice certain. "A rock dam. The water would be forced over it. I'd hear a whisper, a hiss. This is different." She wiped her ear. "It's a muffled sound, a low, wet thudding, and a crackle, like wet canvas settling." She looked up at him, her eyes catching what little starlight there was. "It's blocked with bags, sandbags, a lot of them. The water isn't flowing over, it's being absorbed. It's being suffocated." Rowan's face hardened. "Where?" "Close, just around this bend." They moved forward, slower now. Rowan took the lead, his rifle held at his hip. The canyon wall curved sharply to the left. As they rounded the bend, the faint, white light of the rising moon finally spilled over the rim rock, illuminating the scene. It was exactly as she had described. A wall, 10 feet high and 30 feet across, had been built from bank to bank. It was a crude, ugly thing. A wall of burlap sacks stacked in staggered rows. The creek, which should have been a steady stream even in a drought, was reduced to a dark, stagnant pool on their side. On the other side, nothing. And there, stamped on the side of every single burlap sack in crude black letters, were the words, "Copper Run Savings." A small fire, barely a glow of embers, burned in a ring of stones on the bank just above the dam. A man sat beside it, wrapped in a blanket, a rifle across his knees. He was humming, his head nodding. "The guard. He's blocking it all," Rowan whispered, his voice thick with a cold rage. "Not just diverting it, all of it." "The springs are just above this," Elowen said, her hand going to the gun in her pocket. "He's stealing the valley's entire blood supply." Rowan handed her the coil of rope. "Stay here, in the rocks. If I'm not back in 5 minutes." "No," she said, grabbing his arm. "Look." She pointed not at the guard, but at the dam itself. "It's leaking. On the far side. He built it on loose shale. He has to keep patching it." As they watched, the guard stood, stretched, and walked to the far end of the dam, disappearing behind a high pile of extra bags. "Now," Rowan said. They moved as one, sprinting across the 50 yards of open, moonlit mud. They did not run for the guard. They ran for the dam itself. They reached the wall of bags, pressing themselves flat against the damp, gritty burlap. It smelled of rot and wet hemp. "He'll be back," Rowan said. He pulled the heavy dagger from his belt. "I'll cut. You watch." He jammed the knife into the seam between two of the bottom bags. The canvas was tough, but the blade was sharp. He began to saw, his muscles bunching. A shout came from above them. "Hey, who's down there?" The guard was back. He hadn't gone to patch the leak. He had gone to relieve himself. He stood silhouetted against the moon, leveling his rifle. "Rowan!" Elowen screamed. Rowan didn't look up. He just kept cutting. "Get down!" A shot exploded, the sound deafening in the narrow canyon. The bullet sparked off a rock just above Rowan's head. He grabbed Elowen by the front of her shirt and threw them both sideways, tumbling down the muddy bank into the shallow, dry ditch that ran alongside it. They landed hard, the air knocked from her lungs, Rowan's body covering hers. "Stay down," he commanded. Another shot. Crack! The bullet thudded into the mud where they had been. "I see you, Pike," a voice yelled. It was Jack's Tully. "Cutter said you'd be stupid. I didn't think you'd be this stupid, and you brought the witch with you." He fired again, the shot blind, into the ditch. The bullet whined past, yards away. "He can't see us well," Rowan breathed, his face next to hers in the mud. "But he will. He has to come down to the bank to get a clear shot," Elowen whispered, her heart hammering against her ribs. "And when he does—" Rowan checked the action on his rifle. "Wait." Elowen's mind was racing. She wasn't a fighter. She was a healer. She thought about ingredients. She unslung her satchel. "The chase. Give me a chase." Rowan looked at her. "What?" "Creosote. It burns. Get him to follow me." "Absolutely not. He's not after you. Rowan, he's after me. He called me witch. Use it." Before he could argue, she grabbed her satchel and scrambled out of the ditch, running low, away from the dam, toward a thick stand of head-high creosote bushes. "There she is," Tully yelled, a note of triumph in his voice. "The witch is running!" Another shot rang out, kicking up dust at her heels. Tully was crashing down the bank, abandoning his high ground, eager for the capture. Rowan broke from the ditch and ran back to the dam. "Tully, over here!" he yelled, firing his rifle into the air, trying to draw him back. But Tully ignored him. He was focused on Elowen. "You're done, witch!" he roared, plunging into the dark maze of creosote bushes. Elowen ducked behind a large boulder. She could hear him, cursing and crashing through the brittle branches, getting closer. Her hands were shaking, but she forced them to be still. She opened her satchel. She did not grab the salve or the mint. She grabbed a small cloth bag from the bottom. Dried chili peppers, tiny, red, and lethally hot, the kind Inez used to purge lung infections. She heard him stop, listening. "I know you're in here." She waited. He stepped around the boulder, his rifle raised, a grin on his face. He was 10 feet away. He never saw her move. She threw the entire bag, a full handful of crushed, dried chilies, straight at his face. Tully screamed. It was not a sound of pain. It was a shriek of pure, blinding agony. He dropped his rifle, his hands flying to his eyes. "Ah, God, my eyes, it burns!" He stumbled back, clawing at his face, weeping and howling, completely blind. Elowen didn't wait. She ran from the bushes, back toward the dam. Rowan had not been idle. He had cut through the first bag. A torrent of thick, muddy water was pouring out. He was working on the second. "Get back!" he yelled as she approached. He plunged the knife in deep, twisted it, and ripped the blade upward. The burlap sack, strained to its limit, tore open with the sound of a cannon shot. The dam did not break. It disintegrated. The wall of water, held back for weeks, burst free. It was not a creek. It was a brown, churning monster. It struck them with the force of a locomotive. Elowen was swept off her feet instantly. tumbling end over end in the freezing, debris-filled water. She gasped, swallowing mud. Her body slammed against a rock. She lost all sense of direction. There was only the roar and the cold. She felt a hand. It was not a hand. It was a steel trap. Rowan had grabbed the front of her shirt, his other hand clinging to a root protruding from the bank. The water tore at them, trying to pull them down into the canyon. "The rope!" he bellowed over the roar. He was losing his grip. She fumbled at her shoulder. The rope was still there, a dead weight. She couldn't get it undone. Rowan let go of the root. He grabbed her, pulling her against his chest as the current spun them. He found the rope, and with a desperate, lunging motion, he threw the coiled end toward the bank. It caught, snagging on the same sturdy root he had just abandoned. He grabbed the line with both hands, the hemp biting into his palms. The water pulled, but the rope held. He was anchored, with Alowan clutched in his arm. "Hold on," he grunted. He began to pull, hand over hand, fighting the immense pressure of the current. It was a battle for inches. His boots found no purchase. He was pulling both their weights against the river. Alowan, her arms locked around his neck, could feel the muscles in his back and shoulders straining to the point of failure. He was breathing in great, ragged gasps. He hauled them closer, the water shifting from their chests to their waists, until he could finally get his feet under him. He dragged them both onto the muddy bank, collapsing on his hands and knees. They stayed there, side by side, coughing up water and mud, gasping for air. The roar of the freed creek filled the night. It was a triumphant, living sound. The cedar draw was breathing again. The moon, now high, cast a brilliant silvery light on the new, tumbling river. Row examples of your chat history have been reviewed to improve the quality of your responses. They sat there for a long time, the only sound their ragged breathing and the song of the water. Alowan was shaking. It was not from the cold, though she was soaked to the bone. It was the release, the terror of the fire, the fear of the mob, the violence of the water. It all came pouring out in a tremor she could not control. Rowan pushed himself into a sitting position. He was covered in mud, his face grim. He looked at the rushing water, then at her. He reached out, his hand hovering. He didn't touch her face. He touched her arm, his fingers brushing the wet sleeve. It was a simple, grounding gesture. His hand was rough, calloused, and steady. She looked at his hand, then at his face. Their eyes met. In the moonlight, she could see the cut on his cheek from where the rifle shot had sent rock chips flying. He didn't speak. He just held her arm, his grip firm. She felt his pulse, or maybe it was hers, a frantic beat that slowly began to match the rhythm of the river. He had shielded her from the bullet. He had pulled her from the water. Her shaking did not stop, but it changed. It was no longer the tremor of fear. It was the tremble of a body that had survived. "Tully," Rowan said, his voice a rasp. He looked back at the creosote bushes. The screaming had stopped. "He's blind," Alowan said, her voice hollow. "The chilies, he'll live." Rowan stood, pulling the rope free. "But we have to go." He looked at the wreckage of the dam. The burlap sacks were scattered, tossed by the current. One of them had washed up right at their feet. It lay flat. The words, "Copper Run Savings," clear and black in the moonlight. Rowan pulled his dagger, cut a large square from the sack, and folded it, stuffing it into his shirt. "Proof. We can't go back the way we came," he said. "Tully may be blind, but he's not alone. He would have had a horse." He looked up, scanning the canyon rim. "They'll be riding by now." He helped her up, his hand warm and strong in hers. He didn't let go immediately. Their palms touched. It was the first time they had touched not in violence or desperation, but in a shared, breathing moment. "This way," he said, finally releasing her. He pointed not down the canyon, but up, toward a narrow, dark, split in the rock. "Through Blue Rock Gap. It's harder, but it will bring us out above the ranch. They'll never look for us there." As they began to climb, Alowan looked back, far down the valley, in the direction of Copper Run. She saw them, 3, no, 4 dark shapes moving fast against the skyline. Horsemen, riding without lanterns, following the sound of the new river. They were already hunting. The climb up Blue Rock Gap was not a trail. It was a scar. It was a narrow, vertical chimney of shattered rock and loose scree, a place where the mountain had cracked open. Rowan went first, his rifle slung across his back, testing each handhold before heaving himself up. Elowen followed, her hands raw, her lungs burning. The mud from the river, caked on her trousers and boots, made every movement a slippery, dangerous gamble. Below them, the canyon floor was alive with sound. The rush of the newly freed river, and a new, uglier sound, men shouting. The riders. They had fanned out, their voices carrying on the cold air, angry and confused. "They'll be up here," one man yelled. "They didn't go downriver. Spread out, find 'em, Tully wants that witch alive." A shot echoed, a flat crack that ricocheted off the canyon walls. Not aimed at them, but a signal of the hunt. Elowen pressed herself flat against the rock, her breath catching. Rowan didn't pause. He reached down, his hand grasping her forearm. "Don't look down. Look at me. Keep climbing." His voice was not comforting. It was a command, an anchor. She focused on his hand, on the next rock, on the burn in her legs. They climbed for what felt like an eternity, the shouts fading slightly as they gained height. The air changed. The wind, which had been still, began to moan through the high crevices. It carried a new smell, not just rock and pine, but the damp, heavy scent of ozone. "Faster," Rowan grunted, pulling himself over a ledge. A few drops, cold and heavy as coins, struck the rock by her face. Then, as if a dam in the sky had broken, the rain came. It was not a drizzle, it was a deluge, a sheet of icy water that hit them with the force of a physical blow. The world dissolved into a wall of sound and driving cold. Within seconds, they were soaked anew, the rain washing the mud from their clothes only to replace it with a deeper, bone-chilling wetness. "This way!" Rowan yelled over the roar. He was on a wide ledge now. He pulled her up. The rain was a blessing and a curse. It would wipe out their tracks, but it would kill them just as surely as a bullet. "Where are we going?" she shouted, water streaming from her hair, plastering it to her face. "My north pasture, there's a line shack for the winter riders." He grabbed her hand, and they ran. They were out of the gap, on the high, flat mesa. The wind had no barrier here. It hit them, filled with ice, trying to tear them from their feet. They stumbled over sagebrush and rocks, guided only by Rowan's unyielding grip. Elowen's body, already exhausted, was shutting down. The shivering started, a deep, uncontrollable convulsion that began in her core and shook her arms and legs. She fell, her knees buckling in the mud. "I can't." Rowan hauled her up as if she weighed nothing. He put his arm around her waist, half carrying, half dragging her forward. "Almost there. Don't you quit." She saw it then, a dark, low shape against the gray-black sky. A small, dilapidated shed, barely more than a lean-to. He kicked the warped door, and it scraped open. He pushed her inside, into a blackness that smelled of old hay, rust, and pack rat leavings. He slammed the door shut, plunging them into near-total darkness. The roar of the storm muffled to a low, drumming thunder. Elowen collapsed against the wall, her teeth chattering so violently she could hear them click. This was not the tremor of fear. This was the cold, the river, and now the rain. Her body was giving up. Rowan was a shadow, moving with frantic purpose. A match flared, his face illuminated for a second, grim and set. He lit a lantern on the wall, and the small, filthy room was revealed. It was tiny, just a dirt floor, a broken cot, and in the corner, a small, pot-bellied stove, rust covering its sides. He turned to her. She was huddled against the log wall, her arms wrapped around herself, shaking so hard she looked like she was seizing. "The clothes," he said, his voice rough. "They have to come off. Now!" He shed his own heavy cloak, soaked through, and threw it to the floor. He moved toward her. Elowen flinched, her eyes wide. She tried to say something, but her jaw was locked by the chattering. He was not asking. He moved with a clinical, detached urgency. His hands went to the buttons of the flannel shirt, his shirt that she wore. His fingers, numb with cold, fumbled with the wet cloth. He was focused, his gaze on the task. Not on her. He pulled the wet shirt from her shoulders, and as he did, his thumb brushed the skin of her arm. He froze. He stopped, his hands hovering. The lantern light was dim, but it was enough. Against the pale skin of her wrist and forearm, a dark, ugly bloom of bruises was forming. Finger marks. His, from the river, from when he had held her against the current, his grip a steel trap that had saved her life and marked her skin. He stared at the marks. His jaw clenched so hard a muscle jumped. He had seen the fire, the mob, the gun. But this was different. This was the proof of his own violence. Unintentional but real. Written on her body. His eyes, usually so cold and empty, were suddenly choked with a storm of their own. He looked, for a single, shattering second, like a man about to break. He pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned. Elowen saw him looking. She instinctively tried to cover the bruises, her other hand trembling as she raised it. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice a reedy, shivering breath. He turned his back to her, a sharp, violent motion. He slammed his fist against the log wall, a low, guttural sound of rage in his throat. Rage at Cutter, at the town, at the storm, but mostly at himself, at his own helplessness. "I am so tired," she said. The words were almost silent, lost in the drumming rain. He stopped, his fist still against the wall. "I am so tired of being strong," she said, the admission tearing out of her. The tears came then, hot and immediate, mixing with the rain on her face. "Of being alone, of fighting and running. I'm just so tired." He was still for a long moment. The rain hammered the roof. Slowly, he turned back to her. His face was ravaged, the iron mask gone, replaced by something raw and exposed. He met her eyes. "Then lean on me," he said, his voice low, rough with emotion. "Just for tonight, lean on me." He moved, his purpose returning. He found a crate in the corner, kicking it open. Inside was a thick, musty wool blanket. He shook it out, the dust motes dancing in the lantern light. He wrapped it around her, his hands gentle now, careful not to touch the bruises. He pulled her away from the cold wall, sitting her on an old stool. He turned to the stove, his focus absolute. He used his knife to shave tinder from a dry log stacked in the corner. He laid the fire with practiced hands, and soon, a small, crackling fire was fighting back against the cold. The stovepipe rattled, but it held. A wave of dry, metallic heat began to radiate into the tiny space. Elowen huddled closer, the wool blanket clutched to her chin. Rowan took her soaked clothes, and his, and hung them on rusty nails driven into the walls. Steam began to rise from the damp flannel, filling the air. He sat on the floor, his back against the opposite wall, feeding small pieces of wood into the stove. They sat in silence for a long time. The only sounds were the fire's crackle and the relentless, driving rain. The air grew warm, the heat and the steam and the smell of the old wool blanket. All of it began to thaw her. The violent shivering subsided, leaving her with a deep, aching exhaustion. She looked at him. He was staring into the stove's small, grated door, the orange light flickering on his face. "Inez, the woman who taught me," Elowen said, her voice quiet, finding its strength. She said a body holds on to what the mind can't, the cold, the fear. He nodded, not looking at her. "My sister," he said, his voice flat, startling her. He never spoke of himself. "She died of a fever, in Kansas. I was 15. All the blankets in the house couldn't make her warm." He tossed another piece of wood into the fire. "I hate the cold." It was the most he had ever told anyone. The air in the shed grew thick with new smells. The sharp, clean scent of the burning pine, the damp wool, the metallic tang of the hot iron stove, and from her satchel, which she'd placed near the stove to dry. A new scent uncurled as it warmed the faint, herbal fragrance of the one thing she had saved, time. It was a strange, intimate perfume, the scent of survival. She shifted, pulling the blanket tighter. He looked up, his eyes meeting hers across the small space. The air was charged, no longer with fear, but with something else, something quiet and heavy. He stood, moved to the crate, and pulled out a second, thinner blanket. He sat on the floor, not opposite her, but near the stove, his back against the wall. He motioned to the space beside him. "It's warmer here," he said. She hesitated. Then, pulling her blanket, she moved from the stool and sat on the floor beside him. Not touching, but close enough to share the stove's direct heat. They sat side by side, staring at the fire. "Rowan," she said. He turned his head. She didn't plan it. She only knew that the man who had looked at the bruises on her arm with such self-hatred was not the man the town saw. He was not the cold iron they whispered about. He was the man who had pulled her from the fire, who had shielded her with his body, who had pulled her from the water. She leaned in and kissed him. It was a simple, hesitant touch. Her lips, still cold, pressed against the corner of his mouth. It was a gesture of gratitude, of acknowledgement. He went perfectly still. He didn't respond. He didn't pull away. He just stopped. She pulled back, her face flushing, suddenly afraid she had crossed a line, mistaken his protection for something else. "I'm sorry, He turned his head fully. His hand came up, not fast, but slow, giving her time to retreat. His fingers, calloused and rough, brushed the damp hair from her temple. He looked into her eyes, a silent, searching question. She did not pull away. She held his gaze. He leaned in, and this time, his mouth found hers. The kiss was as hesitant as hers had been. It was chapped lips and the taste of smoke, rain, and the faintest hint of coffee from hours ago. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of survivors. Then, something shifted. Her hand, which had been clutching the blanket, came up and rested on his chest. She felt the steady, slow beat of his heart under her palm. The kiss deepened. It was no longer a question. It was an answer. It was a slow, deep exploration, a sharing of breath, a promise that they were both, in this moment, alive. His other hand came up, tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing her cheek. His touch was reverent. His hand moved, sliding from her jaw to her shoulder, his fingers spreading, pulling her slightly closer. His touch was warm and solid. He stopped there, his hand resting on her shoulder, giving her the space to pull away. He did not take. He waited. She felt the tremor in his hand. He was not as steady as he seemed. Elowen broke the kiss, but she did not move away. She pressed her forehead against his, her eyes closing. Her breath was warm against his skin. "Don't rush," she whispered, her voice thick. "Please, let our hearts speak first." He let out a long, shuddering breath, a sound that seemed to come from the deepest part of him. His hand on her shoulder tightened, not in passion, but in relief, in agreement. He simply held her. He pulled back just enough to look at her. He took the blanket from her shoulders and opened the one he had, draping it over them both. He settled back against the wall, pulling her with him. She went, leaning her head against his shoulder. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her close against his side, their bodies sharing the same blanket, the same small bubble of warmth. He rested his chin on the top of her damp hair. They stayed that way. They did not speak. The storm raged outside, a wild and violent thing. But inside the shed, there was only the sound of the fire and the quiet, steady rhythm of two people breathing in unison. She was warm. She was safe. And for the first time in her life, she was not alone in the storm. She slept, a deep, dreamless sleep, her body finally surrendering to the exhaustion. Rowan did not. He held her, his arms locked around her, his rifle on the floor by his hand. He watched the fire burn down to embers, and he watched the first, pale gray light of dawn seep through the cracks in the door. The rain had stopped. Elowen woke to the silence. She stirred, her body stiff, but warm. She was still pressed against Rowan's side, his arms still around her. He had not moved. She looked up. He was watching her. His face was gray with exhaustion, a dark stubble covering his jaw, but his eyes were clear. A single ray of sunlight, watery and weak, pierced a hole in the roof and lit the dust in the air. It touched her face. Elowen smiled. It was not a large smile. It was a small, fragile, hesitant thing. A smile that had not been used in a long time, but it was real. Rowan's expression softened. He raised a hand and brushed his thumb across her cheek, a gesture of profound tenderness. "From now on," he said, his voice a low, morning rasp. "You do not walk through the storm alone." The understanding was silent. It was a promise made and accepted, a boundary of respect, built not on words, but on a shared night of survival. They dressed in their clothes, now stiff and dry. The smell of smoke baked into them. As they prepared to leave the shed, Elowen stopped. She took her canvas satchel and removed the small, scorched linen bag of thyme seeds. It was dry, safe. She looked around the small, mean shed that had saved them. On a low-hanging rafter, a rusty nail protruded. She reached up, and with the bit of singed drawstring, she tied the small bag to the nail, where it hung in the single shaft of morning light. Rowan watched her. "A payment for the shelter." "No," she said, looking at the tiny, precious bag. "A promise for a new garden." The cedar draw, swollen with its stolen water, roared through the valley. Its voice was the first thing the people of Copper Run heard, and it was a sound of resurrection. By mid-morning, the town hall, which also served as the sheriff's office and the courthouse, was packed. It was not a formal trial. Judge Harlan, a man whose spine had been bent by years of appeasing the valley's most powerful interests, sat behind his desk, looking trapped. Sheriff Brody stood by the door, his hand on his gun, his face a mask of anxious neutrality. Then Rowan and Elowen walked in. A hush fell, the crowd parted, a sea of confused, tired, and angry faces. They were ranchers who had seen the water return. They were townsfolk who had been fed a diet of fear. Ephraim Cutter was there, sitting in the front row, looking concerned. Reverend Silas Crowley stood beside him, his arms crossed, his face a thundercloud. Rowan did not wait to be announced. He walked to the judge's desk and dropped 2 items on the blotter. The first was the heavy, warped iron hasp. The second was the muddy, still damp square of burlap marked Copper Run Savings. "The hasp," Rowan said, his voice filling the room, "is from Elowen Hart's barn, the one she was locked inside." Judge Harlan poked the iron. "That's a heavy piece. It's St. Louis iron," Rowan said, his eyes finding Macklin Dorr, who stood at the back, his face pale. "Imported special by Mr. Cutter." Cutter laughed. A short, sharp bark. "Judge, this is absurd. Are we blaming the drought on my hardware now I import supplies for my properties? It's hardly a crime. Someone must have stolen it." "And this?" Rowan unfolded the burlap. The mud on it was still dark. "This was stolen, 2 from a wall of hundreds just like it. A wall built across the cedar draw, just below the springs." A collective gasp went through the room. The ranchers surged forward. Damn," one man yelled. "You damn the draw. Cutter." Cutter stood, his face a mask of civic duty. "A temporary measure, a reserve, for the good of the town to protect what little water we had from evaporation. Yes, I was protecting our assets." "You were stealing our lives," another shouted. "And you used this woman to cover your tracks." Rowan's voice cut through the noise. He pointed at Elowen. "You needed a scapegoat. You needed a witch." "Witch," Crowley roared, stepping forward, his finger jabbing. "Do not be fooled. Look at them. They walked through the storm. They were gone all night. They consorted with the darkness. And the rain came. It was a satanic bargain. They broke the dam with black magic." The room faltered. The fear was still strong. It was easier to believe in a hex than in a conspiracy. Elowen stepped forward. She was still wearing Rowan's trousers. Her hair was still damp and wild. She looked at the judge, but she spoke to the ranchers. There was no magic, she said, her voice quiet, but carrying. There was a wall of bags. And this, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a small handful of wet, gray-blue clay. She held it out. This is blue rim clay, she said. It's only found up in the high springs, where the water is fastest. It's what holds the banks together. She walked to the burlap sack on the desk and held the clay next to a smear on the fabric. They were identical. This dam wasn't old. It wasn't there to reserve water. It was new. The burlap is still stiff. The clay on it is fresh. It was built to stop the water, and it was built last week, just when the whispers against me began. She looked at Ephraim Cutter. You cannot blame a drought on a woman. Mr. Cutter, when you are holding the water hostage upstream. The logic was pure. It was simple. It was the science of the earth, and the ranchers understood it. The tide of opinion in the room turned. A heavy, dangerous thing. I deny this, Cutter stammered. This is slander. Macklin, Judge Harlan said, his voice weak. You heard, Mr. Pike. This hasp, is it yours? Macklin Dorr looked at Rowan. He looked at Cutter, who was glaring at him, his eyes promising ruin. He looked at Mary, his wife, who stood in the crowd, holding their son. She nodded at him. Just once. Macklin stepped forward, twisting his hat in his hands. No, Judge, it ain't mine. It's like Pike said, St. Louis iron. He took a deep breath. Mr. Cutter. He ordered a dozen of 'em, 2 weeks ago, paid me to sharpen the bolts. What were they for, Mr. Dorr? The sheriff asked. He said it was for a new shed, a drought reserve shed. He called it to store grain. Said he needed 'em strong. The room was silent. Cutter was exposed. She charmed him, Crowley suddenly shrieked, his face purple. She's a witch. She brings her poultices and her dark herbs. She works against God. She's... Enough. Rowan's hand slammed down on the desk. The sound was like a gunshot. You will be silent, Rowan said, his voice a low, lethal command aimed at Crowley. He turned his gaze on the crowd. She is a healer. She uses the plants God put on this earth. She saved my horse. She saved Mary Dorr's son. The science of herbs is not witchcraft. Reverend, it is just knowledge. And it is something you are terrified of. He looked at Cutter. And you are just a common thief. The room exploded. Men surged toward Cutter. Sheriff Brody drew his pistol, firing it into the ceiling. Order, order, Judge Harlan yelled, banging his gavel. This is not a lynch mob. This is an inquiry. And this inquiry is adjourned. I will consider the evidence. Brody, see Mr. Cutter home safely. You're letting him go, a rancher bellowed. It's adjourned, Harlan shouted, and fled into his back office. Cutter, his face white with fury, was escorted out the back by the sheriff, a protective cordon against the angry ranchers. Crowley, for the first time, looked afraid. He slipped out of the room, melting into the chaos. Rowan grabbed Elowen's hand. It's not over. Let's go. They pushed through the angry, shouting crowd and got to their horses. But as they rode out of town, Rowan reined in, his head up, sniffing the air. What is it? Elowen asked. He pointed west, toward Ash Mesa. A thin, dark plume of smoke was rising against the afternoon sky. It was not from his chimney. It was too black. The stables, he whispered, his face turning to granite. He spurred his horse, and they rode. Not as they had in the night, but with a desperate, pounding fury. It was a diversion. While the town was occupied with the hearing, Cutter had sent his men. They were still a mile away when they saw the flames. The main stable was burning, but as they got closer, they saw something else. Figures, people, running from the main house to the well, forming a bucket brigade. When they galloped into the yard, Rowan pulled his horse up short, stunned. Elowen was already off, running toward the flames. B. Nayeli over here, 2 women, their faces smudged with soot. turned. It was B. Montrose and Nellie Cruz, wives from the 2 adjoining ranches. They were not part of Cutter's mob. They were neighbors. "We saw the smoke," B. yelled, her voice hoarse. 3 men. They rode off toward the gap. "We got the main herd out, but your stud, he's trapped in the end stall." A high-pitched, terrified whinny came from inside the burning building. Rowan's prize stallion. "The roof is going!" Nellie shouted, pulling Elowen back. "You can't go in there!" "Wet blanket, Sand," Elowen commanded, her voice cutting through the panic. She was no longer the victim. She was the healer, and this was a wound she could treat. "Don't throw water on the main fire. Soak the walls. We can slow it." Rowan was already moving. He grabbed a horse blanket from the rail, dunked it in the water trough, and ran to the stable door. "Rowan, no!" Elowen screamed. He wrapped the wet blanket over his head and vanished into the black smoke. For a terrible, silent 10 seconds, the only sound was the roar of the fire and the women throwing buckets. Then he was back, stumbling out, choking. He was not alone. He was leading the stallion, a magnificent black horse, its eyes white with terror, its coat singed. But it was limping badly. A heavy beam had fallen, pinning its back leg. The horse reared, screaming, its leg buckling. "It's broken!" Rowan gasped, his heart sinking. "A horse with a broken leg." "It's not broken. It's a burn," Elowen said, her voice sharp. She ran to the horse, her hand out. "Hold his head. Rowan, hold him steady." "Elowen, he'll kill you." "Hold him." Rowan grabbed the stallion's bridle, his shoulder pressed against the horse's neck, speaking low, trying to control the animal's panic. A small crowd had gathered. The ranchers, following them from town, had arrived. They stood and watched, a silent, stunned audience. They had come from a hearing about a witch, and now they were watching that same woman walk into the firelight, toward 1,000 pounds of panicked animal. Elowen approached the horse, her hands empty, her voice a low, steady murmur. "Shh, I know it hurts. I am here to help. Just let me see the fire." The horse shuddered, its ears flat back, but it stopped rearing. It watched her. She ran her hands, light as a whisper, down its sweating neck, its shoulder, and then down its trembling back leg. The horse flinched but held. She found the wound, a long, terrible burn from the smoldering beam, the skin already blistering. "It's deep," she said, "but the bone is sound. Nellie, the water trough, that canvas bucket, fill it, B, in my satchel." "No, it's gone." She stopped, her eyes closing for a fraction of a second. Her herbs were ash. She looked around, her eyes scanning the yard. "Rowan, the well, by the pump. There's a patch of plantain, the broadleaf weed. Get it, a handful, and Mary Dorr. Is she here?" The carpenter's wife stepped out of the crowd. "I am—" "Your child," Elowen said, her eyes on the horse. "The mint tea I gave you, do you have any left?" "Yes, at my wagon." Mary ran. Elowen turned back to the crowd. "I need rags, clean ones, and soap, now." The crowd that had stood silent, ready to condemn, broke. People ran. They returned with shirts, with aprons, with saddle blankets. For the next 30 minutes, Elowen Hart worked. She directed the women to create a cool, clean mint water wash. She showed them how to crush the plantain leaves to release the healing juice. She cleaned the wound, her hands fearless and steady, her voice never rising above a calm murmur, soothing the horse and the crowd. As she worked, she bound the leg with the clean rags, her touch firm. When she was done, the stallion, though still trembling, lowered its head and nudged her shoulder. Elowen leaned her forehead against the horse's neck, her eyes closed, her body finally sagging with exhaustion. No one spoke. B. Montrose stepped forward and quietly draped a dry blanket over Elowen's shoulders. The town had watched her save a life, and in their silence, a deep, grudging respect was born. As dusk fell, Macklin Dorr approached Rowan. The crowd had dispersed. The stable was a smoking ruin, but the horse was alive. Pike, Macklin said, his voice low. He was holding his thick, leather-bound delivery ledger. He opened it to a page. I was afraid of Cutter. He owns my shop, the mortgage. Rowan just waited. Macklin pointed to an entry from 2 weeks prior. 12, St. Louis hasps. 1, keg, 30-penny nails. And at the bottom, a signature, E. Cutter. He's a fool, Macklin said, his voice full of self-loathing. He signed for it himself. He never thinks the small folk keep records. He tore the page from the book and handed it to Rowan. This ain't for the hearing. This is for the fire, for what they did here. Rowan took the page and nodded. You're a good smith, Macklin. No, Macklin said, looking at Elowen, who was sitting by the well. But I'm trying to be. That night, they did not sleep. Rowan and Elowen took 2 of the storm lanterns from the house and hung them on the fence posts by the new corral. They sat on the porch, the shotgun leaning against the wall, the rifle across Rowan's lap. They shared a watch, the lanterns casting a small, defiant circle of light in the darkness. Elowen was writing. Rowan had gone into town 2 days before, while she was sleeping, and had come back with a few things: flour, coffee, and a small, leather-bound journal. He had left it on the table without a word. She dipped the pen in the ink. The first page was blank. She thought of the day, the hearing, the fire, the women who had come to help, the horse's soft breath. She wrote, Trust does not grow from grand gestures. It grows from small actions. A cup of coffee, a shared word, a hand that throws sand on a fire instead of a stone. Trust is a seed. You cannot see it grow until one day it is a tree. The night watch had become a ritual, but it was not a solution. The cedar draw was running, but Rowan's fields, higher up, were still parched. The main irrigation ditch had been damaged in the fire, and he'd spent 2 days hauling lumber, building a long, crude wooden flume to channel a small artery of water from the creek to his wilting hay pasture. It was a temporary fix, an artery of raw pine, and it was deeply vulnerable. They'll come for the water, he said to Elowen, his hammer driving a nail home. Not the house, the water. Then we won't be watching the house, she replied. She was holding a collection of small, rusted metal pieces, old spurs, a broken bit, tin cups. She tied them with twine to a thin wire. They worked together, their movements economical, their words few. He set the main trap. 100 yards from the new flume, he dug a pit. It was not a deep, killing trap. It was just 4 feet deep and 6 feet long, a place of shadow in the moonlit grass. He covered it with a flimsy lattice of dry branches and handfuls of loose prairie grass, making it look like solid ground. Elowen set her trap. She strung her thin wire low to the ground, 50 yards inside the pit, connecting it to a cottonwood tree. The cluster of metal junk hung from a branch, silenced by a piece of cloth. If the wire was tripped, the cloth would pull free, and the chime would ring. A silent perimeter. They didn't have to wait long. The moon was high when the sound came. Not the sharp, metallic ring she had planned, but a low tinkle clink, muffled but unmistakable. Rowan was on his feet, his rifle in hand. He moved from the porch, melting into the shadows of the ruined stable. Elowen was right behind him, the small revolver in her hand. They saw them 3 riders, moving low and fast, heading for the glint of new lumber. They were making for the flume. They had already passed the pit, moving too far to the left. The riders dismounted, pulling axes from their saddles. One man stood back, guarding the horses. The other 2 ran toward the flume, and they hit the wire. The clang, clink, tinkle of the metal chime was shockingly loud in the night air. "It's a trap!" one man yelled. The man guarding the horses panicked. It was Jack's Tully. His eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, his face contorted in a permanent, agonized squint. The Chili's had marked him. Where are they?" he shouted, pulling his gun, firing blindly toward the chime. The other 2, spooked, abandoned the flume and ran back toward him. "This way, you fools!" Tully roared, moving to cut them off. He ran straight into the center of Rowan's trap. The ground disappeared. Tully fell with a grunt, his arms flailing. He landed hard. His pistol flew from his hand, skittering across the grass. Before the dust settled, Rowan was there. He did not aim his rifle. He stepped into the pit, planted a boot on Tully's chest, and pressed the rifle barrel against his throat. "Don't move, Jax." Rowan's voice was cold as a stone. The other two men froze, their axes useless. They saw Rowan, a dark shape of judgment, and they saw Elowen, emerging from the shadows, her small revolver steady, aimed not at them, but at their horses. They dropped the axes. They ran. They did not look back. Rowan hauled Tully from the pit, bound his hands, and left him tied to the porch rail. "He's your proof," Elowen said. "He's a start," Rowan replied. The next morning, Elowen did not wait. She took the large square of burlap, the one marked Copper Run Savings. She had spent the night brewing in ink from oak galls and rusty nails, a dark, permanent black. With a steady hand, using a sharpened turkey feather, she wrote on the fabric. The letters were clear, bold, and neat. "Water belongs to the community." She rode into town alone. The streets were quiet, but curtains twitched. She dismounted in front of the Copper Run Savings Bank. She did not hesitate. She took a hammer and 4 nails from her saddlebag and, with 4 loud, deliberate blows, she nailed the burlap square to Ephraim Cutter's polished front door. She got on her horse and rode away. The silence she left behind was louder than the hammer blows. The explosion came an hour later. Ephraim Cutter, his face the color of spoiled meat, stormed into the judge's office, followed by Reverend Crowley. This is anarchy," Cutter bellowed, throwing his hat on the desk. "I am being slandered. That witch has defaced my property, and Pike, he's assaulted my employee. I want him arrested. I want her arrested." "She's a vandal." Judge Harlan looked tired. He looked at Cutter, then at the ledger page sitting on his desk. The page Macklin Dorr had submitted that morning, the page with Cutter's own signature, authorizing the purchase of the hasps. "Mr. Cutter," the judge said, his voice surprisingly firm, "I cannot, in good conscience, arrest Mr. Pike for defending his property when I have evidence suggesting that his property was attacked on your order, and I cannot arrest Miss Hart for vandalism when her sign appears to be factually accurate." Cutter was speechless. You are siding with them." "I am siding with the law. Ephraim, I've issued a temporary injunction. Your accounts are frozen, pending a full investigation into the matter of the Cedar Draw Dam." Cutter knew he was beaten. The law, for the first time, had turned on him, so he turned to the man who operated outside it. Reverend Crowley stepped forward. "The court," he said, his voice dripping with false piety, "is clearly compromised. The law has failed us, but God has not." He stormed out, his black coat flapping. He went straight to the church and began to ring the bell. A frantic, urgent clang, clang, clang that brought people running from their homes. "A special service," he cried from the steps. "A night of prayer. The town's soul is in peril. We must gather tonight at sundown and pray for deliverance from the evil that walks among us." But Nayeli Cruz, who had come to the mercantile, heard the men who gathered around Crowley after the announcement. She heard the whispers. "Prayer meeting," one said. "We're done praying. Crowley says we bring her back," another muttered. "To the church. A real trial. God's trial." It was not a prayer meeting. It was a lynch mob. Nayeli found B. Montrose. They didn't go to the sheriff. They didn't ride to Ash Mesa. They rode north, fast, toward the dry canyons. At dusk, as the sun bled out of the sky, the mob began to form at the church. They carried lanterns, and they carried rifles. Crowley was on the steps, his Bible raised, his voice high and shrill. "The time for talk is over. The time for action is now. We march and reclaim our town." Just as he pointed toward Ash Mesa, a new cry went up from the edge of town. "Fire!" Fire on the North Ridge. Everyone turned. A column of thick, oily black smoke was rising from the canyons, miles away, in the opposite direction of Rowan's ranch. It was the signal for a brush fire. a true danger to every ranch in the valley. The mob forgot the witch. They remembered their homes. The fire, they yelled. It'll sweep the whole valley. The prayer meeting dissolved. The men ran for their horses, their sense of purpose diverted. They rode north, a frantic posse, chasing the smoke that Nayeli and B had set, a controlled burn of a single dead pinyon pine, a brilliant, false signal. The town was empty. Rowan and Elowen watched the posse thunder past on the main road, heading north. "It's now," Rowan said. They didn't ride. They walked, sticking to the shadows, and came in behind the town. They went to the back of the Copper Run Savings Bank, the warehouse. Rowan took a pry bar from his belt. He didn't bother with the lock. He put his shoulder to the door, found the weak point, and levered the frame until the wood splintered and the lock's hasp tore free. They slipped inside. The warehouse was dark, smelling of sacked grain, leather, and Cutter's imported cigars. They lit a small lantern. It was filled with supplies: sacks of flour, barrels of nails, coils of rope, and in the back corner, a small office. On the desk, pinned flat, was a second map. It was not a survey of the valley. It was a detailed drawing of the high plateau, the Mesa del Cuervo. It showed the 3 springs that fed the Cedar Draw, and drawn in precise, red ink, was a new structure. It was not a temporary dam of burlap sacks. This was an engineered structure of timber and earth, designed to divert the water not down the draw, but west, into the dead lands Cutter owned. The first dam had been a temporary measure to create a panic. This one was permanent. It would kill the valley forever. "He never meant to stop," Elowen whispered, her hand tracing the red line. "He meant to take it all." Rowan looked at the map, his face a mask of cold fury. He looked at the signed ledger page. He looked at the burlap sign. It was not enough. A signature could be forged. A fire could be blamed on anyone. "The town is still afraid of you," he said. "They're chasing shadows. We have to show them the monster." He pointed to the map. "We go at dawn. We don't just cut the bags this time. We tear it down, and we bring the whole valley to watch us do it." They slipped back out, the map safe in Rowan's shirt. They returned to the ranch. The night was quiet, the false fire having drawn the valley's anger miles away. They were safe. For a few hours. They sat in the cabin, the single lantern low. The adrenaline of the night drained away, leaving them in a pool of quiet exhaustion. He was checking his rifle, his hands moving with practiced, efficient motions. She was loading the small revolver, placing each cartridge into the cylinder. A tiny, final sound. She finished. She stood, walked to where he sat, and placed her hand flat on his chest, over his heart. He stopped his work, his hand covering hers, pressing it against him. She closed her eyes, just breathing, feeling the steady, powerful beat beneath her palm. It was the rhythm of the man who had pulled her from the fire, the man who had held her in the storm. It was the sound of steady. "This sound," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It teaches me courage. It makes my own heart braver." He said nothing. He simply turned his head, leaned down, and pressed his lips to the back of her hand. A silent promise, a vow for what was coming with the sun. The dawn was a rumor, a thin gray wash that did nothing to push back the cold. They rode into a world of mist. The high plateau of the Mesa del Cuervo was swallowed by a dense, wet fog that clung to them, muffling the sound of their horses' hooves and soaking their clothes with a fine, cold moisture. It was a ghost's world, and they moved through it like ghosts. Rowan led, his rifle in his lap. He was not following a map. He was following the land. His eyes narrowed, reading the invisible contours. Elowen rode beside him, the small revolver heavy in her belt, the map they had stolen tucked inside her shirt, a stiff, crinkling reminder of the deception. They left the horses in a grove of skeletal junipers and moved on foot, the fog pressing in, visibility dropping to 50 feet. "This is it," Rowan breathed. The air smelled wrong. It smelled of stagnant water, of freshly cut pine, and underneath, the unmistakable odor of a dozen men's stale sweat, coffee, and manure. They crept to the edge of a shallow basin. The fog thinned for a moment, revealing the structure. It was a monster. This was no pile of burlap bags. It was a feat of grim engineering, a solid wall of felled trees and packed earth, 30 feet high and spanning the entire basin where the three springs converged. It had created a large, dead-looking lake. The water, which should have been feeding the valley, was being collected, held, and diverted. A massive, new-cut wooden sluice was being built into the western side, aimed straight for Cutter's dead lands. "He's been building this for months," Rowan whispered, his voice a low, furious growl. And there were guards, not just a few local thugs. These were hard men, wearing cartridge belts and coats that marked them as mercenaries, hired guns from the Las Cenizas mining camps. There were at least 10 of them, clustered around a roaring fire, their rifles stacked. They were confident, masters of this high, hidden fortress. "The plan holds," Rowan said, his face hard. "But the timing is everything." "You see the lever?" Elowen nodded, her eyes tracing the structure. She'd studied the map. The dam was built around a central spillway, held shut by a massive iron pin. The pin was attached to a long, thick wooden beam that acted as a lever. It was the kill switch. "I need a diversion," Rowan said. "A big one? Wait for it." He slipped away into the fog, moving north, toward the pastures where his own small herd of steers grazed. Elowen was left alone, her heart a cold drum against her ribs. She was a healer. Her hands were made for mending, for grinding herbs, for soothing. Now they were poised to destroy. She crept forward, using the fog and the rocks as cover, finding a position in the scree directly above the lever, 100 yards from the guards. She waited. The weight stretched. The fog swirled. The men at the fire laughed. Then came the sound, a low, distant rumble, a sound like thunder, but from the earth. The guards heard it. They stood, grabbing their rifles, looking confused. The rumble grew, becoming a pounding. "What in God's name?" one of them started to say. A man on the edge of the camp screamed, "Stampede!" Rowan burst from the fog, not on his horse, but behind it, waving his hat and firing his pistol into the air. He was driving his entire herd of 30 steers, a wave of panicked, heavy beef, straight through the center of the camp. The camp exploded. Men dove from their tents. The massive coffee pot was sent flying, scattering coals. Horses screamed and broke their tethers. The steers, mad with noise and fear, plowed through the stacked rifles, through the fire, and scattered, bellowing, into the mist. It was total, brilliant chaos. The guards were no longer a defense. They were a scattered, cursing mob, running after horses or trying to dodge the last of the steers. "Now! Elowen!" Rowan's voice bellowed from the fog. Elowen ran. She broke cover, her boots slipping on the wet rock, and slid down the embankment to the lever. It was massive, a log as thick as her body. The pin was huge, seated deep. She put her shoulder to the lever. It didn't budge. She heard a shout. There at the gate, "It's the witch." One of the guards, one who hadn't chased the horses, had seen her. He raised his rifle. A shot cracked, not from the guard, but from the rocks above. Rowan, his rifle at his shoulder, had the guard pinned. The man dove behind a stack of lumber. Elowen strained, her feet slipping, and then the first drop of rain hit her cheek, then another. Within seconds, the gray mist turned into a cold, driving downpour. The plan had just become a gamble. The rain was not a drizzle. It was a flood. It hammered the rock and, more importantly, it hammered the large, dead lake behind the dam. The water level, already high, began to rise visibly. The pressure on the structure was building. "Stop her!" a new voice screamed. Elowen looked up. On the ridge opposite, where the main trail came up, was a new group of riders. Ephraim Cutter, his face purple with rage. Reverend Crowley, his black coat soaked, his face a mask of zealotry. And with them, Jax Tully, his eyes a swollen, weeping red. and 4 more of Cutter's hired men. "She's sabotaging the reserve," Cutter roared. "Shoot her!" The guard Rowan had pinned down was joined by the new gunman. Bullets began to whine off the rocks around Elowin. She was trapped. Rowan fired back, a steady, measured crack. Crack! Crack! Keeping their heads down. But he was 1 man against 5. The dam itself began to groan, the sound of a living thing in pain. The new rain was adding thousands of pounds of pressure, saturating the new earth, finding weaknesses. "Rowan, the pin, I can't move it," she screamed. He left his cover, running in a low crouch, bullets kicking up mud at his feet. He reached her, not bothering with the lever. He pointed his rifle at the sky and brought the butt down, a heavy, crushing blow. On the locking mechanism that held the lever in place, the wood splintered. "Now!" he yelled. They both threw their weight against the beam. It moaned, resisted, and then, with a sound like a breaking bone, the iron pin shot free. For a second, nothing happened. The rain lashed them. The gunmen were reloading. Then the dam screamed. A jet of water, 6 inches wide, shot from the pinhole. Then a groaning, tearing sound. The entire timber frame that held the spillway began to bow outward. "It's going," Rowan yelled. He grabbed her arm. "Run back to the rocks." They scrambled up the slick embankment. They were halfway up when the world ended. The dam did not break. It detonated. The pressure was too much. The entire central structure, tons of earth and timber, was thrown outward in a single, colossal explosion. A wall of water, 30 feet high, white and brown and filled with the wreckage of trees, burst into the canyon. It was a new, monstrous river, born in an instant. The force of it was unimaginable. It scoured the basin clean, ripping boulders from their sockets. Rowan, who was slightly behind Elowin, lost his footing. The ground, saturated by the rain and the failing dam, simply liquefied under his boots. He slid, his hands finding no purchase, his body tumbling down the bank, straight toward the edge of the new, raging torrent. He hit a half-submerged rock and clung to it, the water tearing at his legs, trying to pull him under. He was 10 feet from the main current, but it was eating the bank away, coming for him. "Rowan!" Elowin screamed. She was on solid rock, just above him. She looked around. The coil of rope was with the horses, a mile away. Cutter and his men, on the high ridge, were staring, awestruck and terrified, at the destruction they had built. Jax Tully, his face a mask of weeping agony, raised his rifle. He had a clear shot. Elowin and Rowan, trapped between the rock and the water, were perfect targets. His hand was shaking. This was his revenge. He saw Rowan look up, not at him, but at Elowin. "Stay back," Rowan yelled at her. "It's not stable." Tully watched. He saw Cutter, his employer, the man who had ordered this. "Turn." But Cutter was not turning to help his men, who were scrambling away from the collapsing ridge. He was turning to his horse. He shoved one of his own gunmen to the ground in his haste to get to the saddle and save himself. Tully's arm dropped, the rifle lowered. He stared at Cutter's back. At the cowardice he had dedicated his life to, he spat in the mud. He turned his back on his boss and began to walk, unsteadily, away from the fight. Elowin ignored Rowan's warning. She lay flat on the slick rock, stretching her body as far as she could, her hand reaching out, her fingers straining. "Take my hand!" she shrieked over the roar. The rock under Rowan's boot gave way. He was going. He lunged, a desperate, final motion, and his fingers caught hers. She was not strong enough to pull him. The water was too strong, but she was an anchor. She wrapped her other arm around a small, sharp outcrop of granite, her muscles screaming, her shoulder feeling like it was being torn from its socket. She held him. The first terrible surge of water passed. The torrent lessened, just slightly. "Climb," she yelled, using her arm as a rope. He found a foothold, and then another. He clawed his way up the bank, mud and water streaming from him, and collapsed onto the rock beside her, his chest heaving. They did not speak. They lay on the wet stone, soaked, shaking, their fingers still locked. A great cheer, thin and distant, rose from below. The ranchers, the people from the town, Macklin, B., Nayeli. They had returned from the false fire, had heard the commotion, the gunfire, the stampede, and now this, the impossible, joyous roar of a river reborn. They were at the bottom of the mesa, watching the flood of life-giving water surge down the old, dry bed of the Cedar Draw, scouring it clean, bringing the valley back from the dead. On the ridge, the scene was one of pathetic chaos. The dam was gone. The hired guns were fleeing. Reverend Crowley, his face white with terror, tried to scramble back up the muddy bank. He slipped, his feet going out from under him, and he slid, ignominiously, into a knee-deep pool of mud, his Bible falling from his hand. Cutter was on his horse, galloping down the trail, a desperate lone rider. But as he rounded the first switchback, he reined in. The trail was blocked. Macklin Dorr stood there, his hammer in his hand, and beside him were 20 ranchers, their faces hard. They had come for answers, and they had just received one. Rowan and Elowen finally pushed themselves into a sitting position. They were caked in mud, their knuckles raw, their bodies bruised. The rain had softened, returning to a gray, steady drizzle. Below them, the river they had freed sang its new song. Elowen looked at the water, then at Rowan. She leaned her head against his shoulder, her body shaking with exhaustion and relief. "We gave it a voice," she whispered. "We gave the water its voice back." The town hall was convened not by a gavel, but by the roar of the returning river. The sound of it, a thunderous, joyous noise, was the only thing that mattered. This time, the room was not filled with a mob. It was filled with the entire, humbled population of Copper Run. They were quiet, their faces a mixture of shame, relief, and awe. They had seen the water. They had seen Cutter flee. And they had seen Rowan and Elowen, covered in mud and exhaustion, ride back in, not as witches, but as saviors. Judge Harlan was at his desk. His spine, once bent, was now iron straight. Sheriff Brody, his badge seeming to shine for the first time, stood at the door. At the front, in the prisoner's dock, a section of bench rarely used, sat Ephraim Cutter and Reverend Silas Crowley, both guarded, both mud-stained, both defeated. "This court is reconvened," Harlan said, his voice clear. The evidence was laid out on his desk, the ledger page with Cutter's signature, the scorched burlap sign, the second, damning map of the Mesa del Cuervo Dam. "We have testimony," Harlan said, "from Mr. Jax Tully." Tully was brought in. He was not in chains. His eyes were bandaged, his face scarred by the chilly burns. He stood, and he spoke, his voice a flat, dead monotone, directed at no one, and at everyone. "He hired us, me and the others, said it was pest control, said the witch was blighting the water. Our first job was to set the fire, lock her in, scare her off," he said. "But the hasp, he gave it to us himself. Said to make sure it held." He paused. "When Pike got her out, Cutter was mad. He wanted her gone. Then, when the dam broke, the first one, he ordered us to patrol, to shoot Pike on sight." He turned his bandaged head toward Cutter. "He never paid us for the dam job. He just ran, left us up there, left me." He said nothing else. He was done. "Ephraim Cutter," Judge Harlan said, his voice ringing, "this court finds you guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder, arson, the theft of public assets, namely, the water of the Cedar Draw and the endangerment of this entire community. You will be held for the federal marshal. Your assets are seized, to be placed in trust for the town you tried to kill." He then turned to Crowley. "And you, Silas Crowley, you used the fear of God to incite the hatred of men. You wielded your pulpit as a weapon. You are charged with conspiracy and inciting a riot. You are hereby stripped of your seat on the town council and banished from this territory. If you are seen here after sundown tomorrow, you will be jailed." Cutter was silent, his face a white mask of ruin. Crowley started to babble, to quote scripture, But the crowd was silent. They did not listen. They turned their backs on him. Justice, when it finally came, was simple, heavy, and absolute. Rowan and Elowen walked out of the town hall into the bright, clean afternoon. The river was a song in the distance. The crowd followed them, but they did not shout. They gathered, hesitant. It was Mary Dorr, the carpenter's wife, who stepped forward first. She was holding a basket covered with a cloth. Her young son, the one Elowen had saved, was holding her hand. "Miss Hart," Mary said, her voice trembling. She held out the basket. We were wrong. We were afraid. And you were brave." She uncovered the basket. It held a fresh loaf of bread, a small jar of preserves, and a bundle of dried herbs from her own small garden. "It's not much, but thank you for my son, for the water." Elowen accepted the basket. She looked at Mary and at the faces around her. She saw no hate, only a deep, collective shame and a desperate hope. "The water is back," Elowen said, her voice carrying, clear as the new air. "But the drought was not the enemy. Mr. Cutter was not the true enemy. The fear was, the fear of scarcity, the fear of each other. That is what let him almost win. That is what we have to fix." She looked at the ranchers, at Macklin, at Bay and Nayeli, who stood beside her. "We cannot go back to every man for himself. It is too easy to break one ranch. We must be a valley, together." She proposed it then, her voice gaining strength. "The Cedar Water Fund. Not a bank," she said, "but a co-op. Every ranch contributes, not with money, but with what we have. Lumber from the high country, labor from our hands. We will build, together, a new irrigation system, one that is fair, one that serves all. We will have a board, elected. We will share the water, and we will share the work. And when the next drought comes, we will face it as one." There was a long silence. Macklin Dorr stepped forward, his hammer still in his hand from when he had blocked the road. "I'll forge the gates," he said, his voice rough, "for my share, and we'll supply the lumber." B. Montrose said, pulling her neighbor close. "And I," said the carpenter, "will build the flumes." A murmur of agreement went through the crowd. It was not a cheer. It was a vow. The community, broken by fear, was beginning to mend, starting with a new promise. Weeks passed. The sound of hammers became the new song of the valley, second only to the river. At Ash Mesa, the ruined stable was cleared. A new structure began to rise, but it was different. Rowan worked, but he was not alone. Macklin was there, and the carpenter, and 2 other ranchers. They were building the first headgate for the new water fund, on the side of the new barn, facing the road. Rowan had framed a separate room. It was small, with a clean pine floor, a wide window, and its own door. Elowen, her hands stained with earth, was kneeling nearby. Her own small garden was growing. Women from town, the same ones who had once crossed the street to avoid her, had brought her seedlings, a bit of mint from Mary's yard, some wild bergamot from Nayeli's. Her apothecary was being reborn, gifted to her by the community. She walked over to Rowan, who was setting the window frame. "This room," she said, "it's not for tack." He straightened, wiping sweat from his brow. He looked at the room, then at her garden. "This is a hard road. People get sick, they get lost, they get broken." He nodded to her. "They'll need a place, not a doctor's office in town, but a place to heal, a place to rest and mend." He had built her a sanctuary, a clinic, a home for her work, open to the world, not hidden from it. That night, the work was done. A soft, gentle rain began to fall. A farmer's rain, not a storm. It whispered on the new shingles of the roof. They sat on the porch, in the 2 wooden chairs, side by side. The air was cool and smelled of wet dust and the pine shavings from the day's work. Elowen drew a deep breath, letting the exhaustion of the day settle over her. "The last time it rained like this," she said, her voice a low murmur. "We were in that shed, freezing." Rowan looked out at the darkness, at the pinpricks of rain dancing in the lantern light. "This is better." She turned, looking at his profile. The hard line of his jaw softened by the shadows. He turned to meet her gaze. The long day of shared work, the easy silence, the gentle rain had all settled around them, a blanket of quiet intimacy. He leaned in, and she met him. The kiss was not the desperate, clinging kiss of survival. It was a kiss of choice. It was slow and deep and sure. It tasted of the rain and of a future they were building with their own hands. His rough hands came up to cup her face, his thumbs brushing the contours of her cheekbones, as if memorizing her. Her hands rested on his shoulders, then slid up, her fingers tangling in the thick hair at the nape of his neck, pulling him closer. It was a kiss of profound tenderness, a long, silent conversation. His heavy rancher's coat, which he had draped over her shoulders against the evening chill, slipped, unheeded. It fell from her shoulders onto the arm of the chair, a quiet, discarded thing. His arm slid around her, pulling her from her chair and onto his lap, his hold sure and protective. Their hands found each other, fingers entangling, clasping tight. The kiss broke, but they did not part. He rested his forehead against hers, their breath mingling. The camera of the mind would pull back then, moving through the open doorway into the warm, lamp-lit cabin. It would leave them there on the porch, two dark silhouettes against the soft, gray rain. And from the darkness, you would hear a low, shared laugh, a sound of pure, simple contentment, a sound that blended with the whisper of the falling water. She leaned her head against his chest, right over the steady beat she knew so well. "I spent my whole life running," she whispered, her voice muffled against his shirt. "Running from the town where my mother died, running from the whispers. I came here to hide." She tilted her head back, looking up at him. "I'm not running anymore. I choose to stay, not because I'm afraid to leave, but because this is home." He held her, his heart swelling with a feeling he had no name for. He looked at this woman who had faced fire and water and hatred, and had answered it all with courage and healing. He set her gently on her feet, stood, and took her hand. "Wait here." He went inside. He went to the old wooden chest at the foot of his bed, the one that had held the revolver, the one that held his past. He opened it and took out a small, dark wooden box, worn smooth with time. He came back to the porch. He stood in front of her. He didn't kneel. He looked directly into her eyes. He opened the box. Inside, on a bed of worn velvet, there was no diamond. There was no gold. There was only a small spool of simple, faded, dark blue ribbon. "My mother," he said, his voice low and rough, "tied this on my father's wrist when they claimed their land in Kansas. They had nothing but a sod house and a bag of seed. He was buried with it." He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "In this country, Elowen, a promise matters more than metal. A vow is built with what you do every day." Elowen felt tears well, hot and sudden. She understood. This was a proposal of partnership, a vow of a shared life. She took the spool from the box. Her hands were trembling, but she did not tie the ribbon on her own hand. Instead, she took his left hand, the broad, calloused hand that had built her a home, the hand that had pulled her from the fire. With infinite tenderness, she unspooled a length of the blue ribbon. She wrapped it around his thick wrist, her fingers brushing his skin. She tied a simple, firm knot. It was not a ring. It was a bond, a simple, sacred, and unbreakable promise. He was hers, and she was his. A few days later, the sound of hammering came from the end of the long dirt road that led to the ranch. Macklin Dorr and the carpenter were setting a new sign, one Rowan had paid for with lumber. It was large, carved from a single slab of ponderosa pine. It did not say Pike or private property. The carved letters, dark and deep, read Ash Mesa, and beneath it, a second line, Water for All. The spring of 1887 arrived not with a sudden burst, but as a slow, steady easing of the high country's grip. The snow on the mesas melted, and the cedar draw, now fat and confident, ran clear and deep. At Ash Mesa Ranch, the change was more than a season. It was a resurrection. Where the scorched bones of the old barn had been, a new, stronger structure stood. The raw pine already fading to a warm silver in the sun. But the true miracle was the garden. Elowyn's herb garden, planted in the rich dark earth by the side of the new rest-mend room, was a riot of life. The thyme she had saved, the seeds from the shed, had taken root, spreading in a thick, fragrant carpet. Beside it grew the mint gifted by Mary Dorr, and the bergamot from Nayeli, and a dozen other plants brought in small, hopeful pots by the women of the valley. It was a patchwork quilt of forgiveness, and it was flourishing. The sounds of the ranch had changed, too. The silence of two solitary people was gone. Now, there was the sound of children. The ranchers, busy with the new co-op, had taken to dropping their young ones at Ash Mesa, which had become the valley's unofficial heart. On this afternoon, 4 children, none older than 10, were running races around the basil beds, their laughter a high, clear sound that carried on the wind. There was no fear here, no shadow of violence. They ran, they fell, they got up, their knees stained with green. Rowan, his back against a corral post, was showing 2 of the boys how to tie a proper bowline. His large, calloused hands moved with a slow patience, guiding their small, clumsy fingers. He was teaching them the knots that held a ranch together, and he did it with a quiet focus, his voice a low, steady rumble they strained to hear. Elowyn was with the girls, a few yards away, kneeling in the garden. She was not just weeding, she was teaching. "You see this one," she said, holding up a broad, fuzzy leaf. "This is mullein. You listen to it." A small girl, Mary Dorr's daughter, leaned in. "It doesn't say nothing." "Not to your ears." Elowyn smiled, brushing the leaf against the girl's cheek. "It speaks to your lungs. It feels like a blanket." "Yes, that's what it does. It makes a warm blanket for a cough." She then pointed to a bright, pretty flower. "And this one foxglove, beautiful. But it holds a secret. It can make a weak heart strong, or it can make a strong heart stop. You never touch this one. You respect it. You understand, the earth doesn't have good plants and bad plants. It has strong plants. And you have to learn their names before you ask them for help." She had them listen to the gurgle of the irrigation ditch. "That," she said, "is the voice of the water. It's happy. It's running where it's meant to. You learn that sound. And if it ever stops, you come and tell me." A covered wagon, old and weathered, rattled to a stop by the new sign. A man and a woman, their faces etched with the dust of a long road, climbed down. They looked thin, and their eyes were weary. This the place?" the man asked, holding his hat. "The sign said water for all. We ain't got much." Elowyn stood, wiping her hands on her apron. "This is the place. You're welcome here. The water is free." The woman looked near collapse. We heard in the last town that there was a room, a place to rest." "You heard right," Rowan said, walking over. "The rest-mend room. It's yours for as long as you need it." That evening, the family was settled. Elowyn brought them a tray. The room, which had once been a plan for a stable, was filled with the smell of her garden of thyme and fennel and of the fresh, warm bread she had just taken from the oven. She had made a simple fever tea for the woman. It was the same tea she had made for Mary's son. It was the medicine of the community. The healing of the valley was slow, but it was steady. In the center of Copper Run, where Crowley's church bell had once rung in fear, a new sound was heard. The rhythmic clank, squeak, clank of a new communal hand pump. Macklin Dorr had forged it himself, his masterpiece. The ranchers had dug the well, and the carpenter had built the housing. It was now the center of town. Women gathered there, not to whisper, but to talk, to trade news and recipes, their buckets lining the trough. They laughed, and their laughter was as clean as the water they drew. The work of redemption was hard. Up in the high country, a lone man, his eyes still weak, his face marked, was loading cut timber onto a wagon. It was Jack's Tully. He had taken the only work he could find, the hardest work hauling the lumber for the new head gates of the water fund. He saw Elowin, who was up on the mesa, gathering willow bark. He stopped his work. He could not speak. He just stood, his hat in his hands. He looked at her, and he gave a single, stiff nod, an acknowledgement of the wound he had caused. Elowin, seeing the man who had tried to kill her, paused. She looked at him, at the sweat on his brow, at the hard, honest labor. She nodded back, not in forgiveness, but in recognition. The debt was being paid. He was finding his own way back. Rowan was at the new barn. The sun was low, beginning its long, slow dive. He was hanging a small, new sign, just over the door of the rest praise room. He had carved it himself. The letters were simple, burned into the wood. The old fire teaches us to keep the new fire in its proper place. He stepped back, looking at the words. The fire that had almost killed them was now a lesson. The fire in the stove was for bread. The fire in the hearth was for warmth. He had put the fire in its place. Elowin walked up, her basket full. She stood beside him, reading the sign. She said nothing, but her shoulder pressed against his arm. He turned to her. The day was done. The children were gone. The valley was quiet. She was sitting on the top rail of the new corral fence, the one he had just finished, her back to the setting sun. The light was a miracle. It was thick and golden, and it caught the flyaway strands of her hair, turning them into a halo of fire. But this was the fire of the sun, the fire of life. He walked over, standing in front of her. He just looked at her for a long moment. This woman who was his anchor, his partner, his home. She smiled at him. Tired? No, he said, his voice a low rumble. He put his hands on her waist. He did not ask. He just lifted. He lifted her from the fence rail, her body light in his strong hands. He turned, and he did not set her down in the dust. He held her, her feet dangling, her body flush against his. It was the echo of that first, terrible night. He had lifted her then, a desperate, smoking burden, from the heart of the inferno, his body shielding hers from the dark and the ash. Now, he lifted her into the last, golden light of the day. He held her, and he looked at her, and his eyes were full of a quiet, profound love. He lowered his head and kissed her, a kiss that was a promise of 1,000 quiet evenings just like this. Later, in the cabin, the lamplight was warm. Rowan was asleep in his chair, his boots off, his face peaceful in a way it had never been. The blue ribbon on his wrist was faded, worn, a part of him. Elowin was at the table, her new journal open. She dipped the pen in the ink, her hand steady. She looked at the man sleeping in her home. She thought of the fire, the water, the new garden, the children. She wrote the last entry. They called me witch when they were afraid of what they did not understand. They called me hex when they needed someone to blame for their own greed. They saw a shadow, and they tried to burn it. But a shadow is just a place where the light has not yet reached. Then he came. He did not call me witch. He called me Elowin. He did not try to save me from my strangeness. He listened to it. He learned its name, and in return, I learned his. From that day, we learned how to water each other's name, and a garden grew. She closed the book. She walked over to him, draping a blanket over his shoulders. She stood for a moment, her hand on his, and looked out the open door. The night was clear. The cedar draw, full and happy, was a ribbon of silver in the moonlight. From far down the valley, from one of the other ranches, came the thin, reedy sound of a harmonica, a slow, simple tune. It blended with the rush of the water. Here in the West, justice is not always the crack of a rifle or the snap of a rope. Sometimes, justice is just the sound of a river, finally returning to its rightful bed. And love. Well, love is the person who is brave enough to walk into the fire, to carry you out of the darkness, and then stay, to build a hearth with you, a place where the fire is only and always for warmth. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be honored if you let us know where in the world you are listening from. Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to Wild West Stories 1850 and give this video a like. And if this story moved you, please consider hitting that hype button so it can be heard by more people.